Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Leonard Lewison. I'm a fellow of the Temenos Academy, which, as you may know, is an educational charity established by Catherine Raine 28 years ago, one of the greatest poetesses of the 20th century, scholar of William Blake and W.B. Yeats. And the patron of the Temenos Academy is the Prince of Wales. I urge you all to pick up a copy of the Temenos Academy summer program up there on the table in the back when you leave, if you don't have one already. It's a great honor tonight to introduce Dr. Martin Shaw, who's a mythologist, an author, a storyteller. His first book was called A Branch from the Lightning Tree, which won the Nautilus Prize for nonfiction. And then he wrote Snowy Tower and Scatterings, which is a trilogy of work on mythology, landscape, and the nature of the soul. He teaches a course at Stanford University in California on oral tradition and mythic life. He's a fellow of the Schumacher College down in Devon, and he created their MA in Myth and Ecology. He's worked for, about a decade and a half with Robert Bly, the great American award-winning, won the National Poetry Award back in the 60s. He's worked with Mark Rylance, with Coleman Barks. He's published in the Mississippi Review, Poetry International, Kenyon Review, Orion, and Poetry Magazine. And his new book, Courting the Dawn, Poems of Lorca, will be appearing this year. He's also worked with at-risk youth, returning veterans, and many people at the crossroads of their lives, and leads retreats in Snowdonia and now in Dartmouth. So tonight he's lecturing for us, and it's a great honor to have him, on small gods and earth that thinks in myth. And I should say that Martin Shaw is a storyteller and extremely lively, and so you won't expect your normal academic lecture. In fact, you should expect something far richer than that. So please welcome Dr. Martin Shaw.
Hello, can you hear me? I'm booming out. So I'm very delighted to be here, and I'm extremely honoured. Thank you for thinking of me, Temenos. Now, I am going to do something actually that I don't often do, which is really properly do my best to read the words that are in front of me rather than fly off like a mischievous bat round the room. It is going to be rich this evening. And it's going to be almost the best part of an hour. And I know that humans are not really designed to be in rooms for the best part of an hour, to be read to. So if I see that you're really starting to flag, something unexpected will happen. All right? Shall we begin? Yes. Okay. They're in little sections. Participation. When I was around 6, my father woke me up early one morning and took me walking through the lanes of Devon. It was dark at first, and as the sky started to lighten, he recited a poem, and it was Sorub and Rustum by Matthew Arnold. Now here's the thing. As he recited it, the sun came up. Now I tell you, when you are 6, this is a devastating act of sympathetic magic. My father's words made the sun come up. Later that evening, as my mother read me stories, I glanced out of the window and I saw a cuticle of moon appearing as she read. My mother's words made the moon come out. La Luna. Now, if this wasn't quite the road to Damascus, it was certainly a glimpse of Lantern Waste. And it gave me a sturdy appreciation of a poem that I'd come to many years later. Some of you will know it. It's by a man called Robert Penn Warren. Here it is. Long ago in Kentucky, a boy, I, stood by a dirt road in the first dark, and I heard the great geese hoot northwards. I could not see them. There was no moon and the stars were sparse, but I heard them. And I did not know what was happening in my heart. Tell me a story. In this century and moment of mania, tell me a story. Make it a story of great distances and starlight. The name of the story will be Time, but you must not pronounce its name. Tell me a story of deep delight. So as a young kid, in a world of post-Copernican vast distances, this opened an incredible door for me. And suddenly trees and rocks and stretches of water, even the gradient of the heavens felt negotiable. I could speak to things and it had impact. The world, the wind and the stars were alive. Everything was intelligent. I didn't even need visionary vegetables to get there. I just needed words beautifully woven. This wasn't something I had to force myself to believe because it was something I had experienced. You know the difference? I'd experienced it. I didn't need to believe it. It had happened. My mind was full of fur and light. An act of reverie had led to participation. I began to think in myth, and my fate as a romantic was sealed. In his book, The Self-Disclosure of God, William Chittick writes about Arabic. There's an old joke that says that every Arabic word has 4 meanings. It means what it means. It means the opposite of what it means. It has something to do with sex. And finally, it's something to do with a camel. Now I tell you, as a child, easy tiger, as a child, I believed that the narratives in folk tales had that kind of multiplicity to them. That under the cloak of words, something highly undomesticated lurked. I would put down my big green book of Robin Hood, and I would find that it had moved to some other part of the house. Has that ever happened to you? You've got a book like that? You put it down and the bloody thing moves. And as I grew older, the meaning of the words and the stories shifted alongside me. As my life got more complex, so did the stories. As humans, I do not believe that we are living myth. I believe we are living myths, plural. They compete. There are differing stories being trying to be told through us. There are different temples that seek our libation, that send us crazy till we blurt them out. I think there are perspectives in us that are not even human. There are thoughts that swoop wonkily through with the bright flash of a jungle bird, or are preserved perfectly in peat until we are ready to be thought by them. Some thinking is very patient. It will wait years for us to catch up. In her vivid essay on the subject of poetic vision, the poet Eleanor Wilner describes William Blake in a way that I think elucidates a bit of this. She says this: Blake's faith is a denial only of the occult. There is nothing that is secret. There is only that which the mind has neglected or feared to regard. The belief that man is capable of coping with his contraries, or her contraries, and of creating a culture which contains them harmoniously is simply the faith that we are capable of becoming everything that we potentially are. And what we potentially are is all we need to be. So I suppose coping with your contraries and creating a culture which contains them is what I would think of as mythic intelligence. Discovering myth, I found it a huge relief to hear about boys who had turned into swans and women that were really seals. Would you remember how exhausting it is to remain in the shape of a little girl or a boy? That's what it was like for me. It was an exhausting and concerted effort to maintain the shape of being a boy for more than about 10 minutes a day. And here was an art form that really understood that. Myth understands that we could break out at any second. If I stared long enough into a poem, I could usually discover the burning ember of its essence. But myth didn't behave like that. It would shift and move in front of my eyes, like Coyote, whose power lives in his nose and tail. Many of the stories seem decentralized in emphasis. They wouldn't stay still. I couldn't freeze frame them. So stories like that, stories that were alive and dynamic, took me back to what I'd seen my mum and dad do when I was small. Story is a form of relatedness. Language is a vehicle for sacred negotiation, praise, even contributing to the maintenance of a cosmos. In an embryonic way, this had now passed into my little bloodstream. And of course, such an opening used to be a regular occurrence. In the myth cycles of the Caucasus, the Nart sagas, the hero, Shoslan, requires bathing in the milk of wolves before he can grow into a man. In ancient Greece, young women would sometimes enter the temple of Artemis to be immersed in the worship of the bear. Without these active interventions, there was no certainty you would grow to become a real human being. There was no certainty. And while not many of us can claim to have bathed in wolf milk or know the archaic dances of the bear god, I suspect in this room alone, some of us have a yearning for connections to a wilder and mystically charged experience of the earth and its inhabitants. Years later, reading Henry Corbin and his wonderful essay Mundus Imaginalis, I came across this. It's a bit of a mouthful on a piece of paper, but I'll read it. For henceforth, the where, the place, is located in the soul. The corporal substance resides in the spiritual substance. The soul surrounds and carries the body. As a result, one cannot say where the spiritual place is located. Rather than being situated, it situates, it is situating. That was what happened to me with my dad when I was 6. I think all 6-year-olds understand Henry Corbin very well. But then we forget, and we have to go through the milky detritus of the amnesia of the world before we remember. And sometimes, if we are lucky, someone in our life will come along to remind us. This little section is called Remembering What We Love. 20 years later, I met the Lakota Sioux medicine man, Wallace Black Elk, and he would encourage a form of prayer so sincere, so eloquent and pointedly nutritious to the earth, he claimed it could make a thundercloud blush. I loved this as much as all of Shakespeare. And I love Shakespeare. And of course, when I saw Wallace doing this, I remembered walking the lanes with my father and listening to my mother. None of these demonstrations were hubristic, but actually very humble and filled with wonder. There was not the aspiration of the overlord, but the servant. As is often the case in my life, big news comes with a sense of dismay. I never take it very well. So when I met Wallace, I have to tell you that at that point my mouth was a prison cell where words went to die, not some mead hall of flowering language, which was what Wallace implied was a necessity to the business of growing into a human, that you could speak out and you could speak really well. From his example, I learned you had to be very careful with your speech. Everyday words would cause a kind of head-on collision with the gardenia or the dragonfly or the curly-bellied mouse you were addressing. What was needed was a language that respectfully circled around them. It's sometimes called twisted language, or in the bardic tradition, dark speech. That we should have many inventive ways to praise a white lily, a boar tusk, or a cormorant feather. In her essay on the symbol, Kathleen Raine notes that mythic language, its utterances, this is a quote, are in a high style, hieratic, grandiose, as far as removed as is possible to be from the speech of the common man in the everyday self. But then she says this: such language comes from encountering the ancient anima mundi, the soul of the world whose images at times, walking or in dreams, we behold with amazement. So beautiful and fraught with meaning do these appear. Because this world is not personal, but common to all its symbols, and they are intrinsically intelligible as Freud's symbols from the personal unconscious are not. So the language is elevated but relatable because it comes from the more than entirely human dimension. In my own life, I would go on after meeting Wallace to spend 4 years in a black tent, exploring pockets of English wilderness, trying to find a connection by will to that which had been gifted me by grace many years before. If I'd known my mythology better, I would have realised this is often the provocation of many a great story. Extravagance. We can't help but notice that myth seems to have a soft spot for beauty. It doesn't hold back to describe the drama of life. When the earth speaks through myth, we seem to find a plumage in the syntax, a few fox bones secreted in the vowel sounds. There's a wonderful kind of extravagance, like a sow rolling in high-class mud. Here is a description of the birth of Genghis Khan. There came into the world a blue-grey wolf whose destiny was heaven's will. There came into the world a blue-grey wolf whose destiny was heaven's will. I don't think it's a bad thing to tell somebody they are a blue-grey wolf whose destiny was forged in heaven every once in a while. Now, I'm not immediately suggesting that we charge Rome, but I once heard James Hillman say, how are you ever going to get off the ground if you're not a little inflated? And actually, under the bluff and the hurrah, I suspect that the West's self-esteem is probably far lower than we may expect, especially with our younger people. You know, I think despite all the calls to individuation and empowerment that fills our media, I think we are heavily defended against an experience of our own beauty. We are heavily defended against an experience of our own beauty. I have a 13-year-old daughter, and I'm aware it's what is coming at her all the time through social media. And beauty may be in the language, but it's not really present. Thoreau lamented that he could not exaggerate enough even to lay the foundation of a true expression. And I think this is where myth comes in, because it amplifies, not pacifies. It makes enormous, not reduced, so we can see a little of the truth of what stands before us. Bad psychology may tell us we are projecting. Myth may tell us we are beholding. So let's try and find somebody who's a little like a blue-grey fox and remember to tell them. As an old mentor of mine once told me, if you have a younger friend and you can't find a way to praise them, in some way you are hurting them. The uncommon eye. An authority on oral culture is a man called Walter J. Ong, and he reminds us that the Hebrew term dabar means both word and event. In an oral-centered society, a word is an event. It carries weight and influence. Ong goes on to give us the illustration of a buffalo hunter being able to smell, taste, or touch a buffalo, even if it is quite dead. But if you hear a buffalo, you better get out of the way. The sound is direct, active, informing. Wallace Black Elk's words were an event. And myth tells us that words that are events have consequence attached. In a Mongolian story, the boy Tovar is taken from his body to the underworld and allowed to bring back a precious gift to prove he made the journey. Everything is in front of him. There are elaborate saddles, there are rolls of silk, there are filigree daggers, there are exquisite felted yurts. He sees it all. But in the corner and in the dust, he sees what he really wants. He can see, secreted in the shadows, all the myths and all the stories and all the legends of his people. And he turns to the Khan of the underworld and he says, "That's what I want." And the Khan says, "You sure you want that?" And he says, "I want it." He says, "Okay." The moment he chooses them as his gift, 2 crows sweep in and take his eyes. A Homer is born, and from that moment onwards, Tarver has to cultivate a visionary capacity. The uncommon eye is often what singles out storytellers. In a story from Dartmoor, a midwife from the village of Holme rubs fairy mud into her eye and from then on lives a psychotropic experience as myriad realities that are usually denied you and I swirl past her moment by moment. In many cultures, these new ways of beholding reality were bedrocks for creation of a kind of storytelling that speaks across species. Storytelling that speaks across species. That the teller could speak with the gossip of the hedgerow in one hand and the warmth of the hearth in the other. Tarver's loss in one area creates an enormous visionary gain in another for the whole culture. There's another thing that I learnt about myth and story from Black Elk. When he told these stories, they were not about remote marbled classical figures, but they were about animals and rivers and lightning storms, small gods, if you will. And they were small not just in dimensions, but in situ. They were not some far distant dimension, but woven into the visual exterior of a cactus or a snow leopard or a soot-black Scottish cave. They were not just the creation of the gods or the symbol of the gods. They were the gods if and when they chose to take that shape. That the very surface of something, not only its interior, could have divine import, that we took appearances seriously. So, what am I saying? When the storyteller speaks of the wild curly spirit, is she in fact just graciously describing the wind? When a myth speaks of a fiery dragon, are they just describing the eruption of a volcano hundreds of years before? Well, that may be sometimes woven in, but I don't think it's the end of the affair and I cannot support it. That kind of reductionism makes myths explicable, safe, and no longer a house for the mysteries, reduced merely to an inventive form of describing elements of the emerging phenomena of the earth. Luckily for all our sakes, myth is usually far messier than that. I don't think it's that the gods are the exterior of the mountain of the ice sheet, but they are woven through both the inscape and the outscape, depending on their mood. Some of the gods are extroverted, some of them are introverted, some both. When they are extroverted, they exfoliate their charm through the opening of a dog rose and into the imaginings of a cat or an old woman. When introverted or just sad, they pull back and into the underneath dimensions we barely have the names for anymore. Somewhere in that back and forth, we got thought by them. And as we lived and we crowed and we fought and we screwed and we died, the pollen of our imagination got scattered into their songlines. The pollen of our imagination got scattered into their songlines. Kathleen Raine says this: "Only after a lifetime have I come to understand that even a real event may be the enactment of a myth, and from that take on supernatural meaning and power. In such cases, myth is the truth of the fact, not fact the truth of the myth." She is amazing. I'm sure you will read her day and night, but I mean, Defending Ancient Springs, if you don't have that book, just track it down. It is dynamite on a china plate. That's good. For how many thousands of years did we ourselves traverse the earth as a kind of spirit being, long before we had the word human? And how many swift and extended flashes of communication lurched up between us and the earth? How many of those gleams of light have found their way into the myths, quietly telling us how to live? It began to occur to me that myth at its most essential was not just formed from neurotic fabrications around death, suffering, and occasional triumph, but actually the most profound form of listening, that it was a kind of echolocation between us and our wider relations. That was a big moment. It was the first time I realised that myth was a form of talking to the earth, but listening to how it responded. Not just talking at it, but listening to how it responded, and how a story may be bent or twisted by the response. That how the story was built was a collaborative enterprise, and how that collaboration was actually a form of love. So now I'm going to talk about love. This section is called "The Eye is the Scout of the Heart." Recently, I was in a room with some academics and some students, and they were talking about reaching out to the wider world. And everybody was in agreement that eros was the bedrock relationship to all living things. When I say eros, I mean a sensual, tingling, vivacious connection. We all liked this idea. You could feel it. Everybody was excited. We were kind of slightly rocking back and forward. It was like a kumbaya moment. You know, it was a big hit. You felt it. You trusted your senses and you took pleasure in them. I think we all like this idea. It's wonderful because it brings us into the present moment. We don't need a scientist or a guru or a preacher. As many have noted, religion is often a wonderful defense against having a religious experience. But this is my caution. Addiction to eros is the end of loyalty to person or place or community. One evening you will wake up and find no nightingale under your window, because it is amor the nightingale comes for, not eros. It has specificity. Eros can't be the whole story, because if it was, we could just squat down anywhere and open to its sensual unfoldings. For most of us, that's not going to work. Some places claim us, some don't, like people. Just as sex without love eventually exhausts us, constant transmogrification through landscape after landscape after landscape can become thin, exhausting, and in the end, superficial. Openness to all can be the end to loyalty to anything in particular. Myth doesn't really traffic in that kind of equality. I think many of the myths are actually infused with amour. And what I mean is this. I think myth, usually it's a kind of a love letter. Think of it as a love letter to a very specific bend of river where the salmon runs in a blue-smoked Connemara autumn, or a crest of Devon granite tors forged from combat between Arthur himself and a powerful spirit. As Tom Waits once said, somewhere, a song needs an address. Every land-spun detail in the myth is an ivory comb through the mane of the story. It is a tenderness, a remembering, an intimacy. We pine when we are away from it. Amour brings heart sickness, not just libido. But that very sickness can have discernment at its core, and I want to defend it. We rarely fight for an abstraction, not necessarily even for our country. If we have to fight, we fight for our regiment, or the village, or the home, or the kids. This specificity and its ensuing heart sickness is not a weakness but an indicator. It provokes what we stand for, how we earn our name. It can flare up enormous acts of courage. I can witness the glory of prairie and Pacific. I truly can. But my feeling relationship with Britain is very, very different. I have been claimed by certain stretches. I can't just bounce from ecstasy to ecstasy to ecstasy across the world. Flower to flower to flower, I think, makes you a gigolo, not a husband. Near and far. And this is where we're getting to really what I want to talk about. That was just a preamble. Sorry. Myths and places require fidelity. This is where I'm going. I love these old-fashioned words. Fidelity. Myths and places want to know if you're serious or not. They have encountered enough people with my pigment rubbing their hands together and looking at a stand of old-growth oak forest as a bit of 2x4. I think myths are exhausted by being auditioned for contemporary polemics and stretched on the rack of whatever neurosis seems most pressing to us this year. We could stop telling stories what they are, we could step back and see what they have to say to us. Because in the end, we don't have the stories. Stories have got us. They have us. Now, I'm going to change emphasis in the lecture, and then I'm going to swoop back. Everything I've said so far is about intimacy of story and place. Now we're going to look at stories with what you could say having a nomadic agency, stories that are actually designed to travel. We know, and I won't fill you with statistics at this point because you're familiar with them, we know that snow geese are wintering up to 200 miles further north these days. Purple finches are trouncing even that with a 400-mile trek from their normal nesting areas. The ruby-throated hummingbird is moving from southeast to central Alaska in this resolute move forward, northward. There was a study recently released revealed that astonishing half of 305 bird species in North America, owls and robins, chickadees and more, are all wintering 35 miles further north than they did 40 years ago. This creates confusion. Cranes wintering in Germany rather than making their long-established southerly flights to Spain or Portugal. It's a risky strategy to remain in a climate that could suddenly turn freezing, at which point the migration is equally hazardous. So, the animals Think of an animal having a kind of a song line, the way it's travelled for thousands of years. The animal's song lines are in a wild state of flux, reinvention, and often flat-out disaster. No one knows how this is going to pan out. Just as birds are winging their way into uncharted experience, so myths and stories are also travelling almost light years beyond their original nests. I think the developments of both are related. If the animals are in flux, that in turn affects the collaborative emergence of the stories we are telling. The animals are myth tellers in the way that they are. The 100 ways the otter crosses a stream is similar to how the storyteller splashes their route through a story. It's always the same destination, but it is different with current, detail, intensity of stroke. It may be that the stories are being forced to move from their old habitations because they have something important to say about this wider crisis. As the crane settles in a new and unfamiliar German forest, so a Seneca shaman story is told in the tentative surroundings of a Plymouth pub. It happens. To repeat, I believe that the two emerging migrations are connected, and they are speaking over frontier divide. Crow to myth, myth to waterfall, waterfall to folktale. Not all these migrations will thrive. The business of a moor will have to be in place. If it was just Eros, everything could just biologically reshape itself and onwards, but it's a more bespoke process than that. Things have to fall in love with each other, or there's no songline. How could this look or be communicated to humans? Well, I think that that's something that requires more than just my opinion, for sure. We would need indigenous peoples, ecologists, trackers, gardeners, scientists and poets, all in on that emerging, to name a few. So I'm just going to recap. Some stories are profoundly place-based, but some are destined to travel. I'm suggesting that we need, at this point in time, to be receptive to both. In my book Scatterlings, which is a kind of mythography of Dartmoor, the deeper I went into the local, the more I found the nomad. It was extraordinary. And the simple reality that the hyena, the elephant, and the redwood was more indigenous to Dartmoor than I would ever be. Isn't that amazing? It was just full of elephants and hyenas. So we are, I think, culturally at a crossroads. And as you will know, when we are at a crossroads, we should emulate one of the gods of the crossroads. That being is the lord of the hinge, the lord of the storytellers. That god is Hermes, a being that talks from both sides of his mouth and looks both ways. So we could, number one, curate a local relationship to place. As Gary Snyder says, be famous for 5 miles. Tune your ear to the gossip of local folklore, plant life, the myriad ways people talk to each other in the wider world. William Blake found much of what he needed in London, with burning bushes and fiery choirs around certain street corners. Now look, I know I'm raising the bar rather high with William Blake, but what I'm really suggesting to you is to become a cultural historian of place. The old Gaelic phrase for that is Shanachai. Cultural historian of a place. It's a very particular kind of storyteller. We are drowning in its deficit. Number 2, develop homemaking skills for welcoming a story. The hour is late. Even on a beautiful summer's evening like this, or spring evening, the hour is late. Much is falling away. And everything that is still alive in these enormous transitions are shouting to everything else that may possibly be alive. Mythologies are commingling and attempting to reform at lightning speed, and although many of stories are place-specific, some have a migratory agency, are designed to travel. They need to be welcomed. So what could be the homemaking skills required to welcome such a story? It will no doubt be powerful, disorientated, and requiring shelter. Amongst all the plastic and the garbage the sea is washing up, things are arriving on our shore we desperately need to know about. And what is coming will not be mythologies, but fragments. Little broken off stories, potent but propelled into their own kind of liminality. Even the stories, even the myths are in the liminal now, rather than resting in the wider den of an established mythos. We don't know if they'll wither or flourish, but quiet attention is a gift we could give them. Let's just see what they want to say to us. Some call this the era of Hermes, due to the speed of communication. But with Hermes, there's a tone to his journeys, and the tone is this: he communicates soul to soul. And if the soul is not open, then Hermes is not present. Remove the flower and the bee is taskless. So we're living in a time where we have information plenty, but do we have meaning? Though it might not be clear yet, in the barrage of statistics and general bad news, these stories bring fragments of meaning in troubled times. Like Psyche, we could separate out the grains of their insight in the half-light. Number 3, rescue thrown away language. Occasionally, believe it or not, people come to me who are planning to get married and they say, what advice would you give us? And my advice is always the same. I say, go out together and study a magpie, and don't come back to me until you know why I asked you to do this. Now this is often the last that I see of them. But if they come back, they always come back with the same insight. And it's this, and many of you will know this. If you really look at a magpie, which looks black and white, secreted somewhere around it will be a blue feather. A blue feather that is not black or white. It's this third Hermean possibility. Now, I don't know about the long married in the room, but I know that, you know what it's like when you're discussing something with force. It's a wonderful thing that some blue-feathered language could emerge between you, which is more than your polemic, more than Derek's polemic, and between you something else can come to light. So I've got pulled away from what I'm reading. I'm sorry, I'm getting excited. To take myth seriously in 2018, we need blue feather language. The immense sophistication of its images will tune conversations to a deeper dimension than the steady drill of statistical misfortune or hand-wringing guilt. Myth is a shield within whose reflection we can view Medusa. If we keep staring head-on into the abyss, we will not have artfulness, we will have burnout. Much nimble language has simply been thrown away in the search for sound bites, so let's rescue it. Pablo Neruda is needed in the House of Commons. With the local and nomadic in dialogue, I want to think a little bit about what emerges in the absence of a community that can maintain both, and also when that isn't there. And I'm beginning to work towards a conclusion now. 20 years ago, I trained as a wilderness rites of passage guide. This focuses on a 4-day and night fast in a remote and wild place. And the patterning of it will be probably fairly familiar to you. You sever from, your life and your job and your usual roles in the community. You go out into the wood just like a fairy tale, and for 4 days and nights you are utterly alone. And in some way, to an Aboriginal mind, you get dreamt by the place. It's usually a fairly grueling experience. You sever, you go into the wild, and you return to your community who feel blessed and raised up by the insight you bring. That's what I trained in for 8 years, a kind of protracted exercise in learning how to listen. But this is what I found. In many indigenous cultures, it's a frightening thing to be separated from your tribe. However, as the years passed, I noticed the ease with which, mainly European folk, they severed from the familiar. In fact, it appeared habitual. What had been profoundly disorientating was already deeply imprinted on the participants. They were addicted to severance. That they were trained to cut away from any experience that does not immediately fulfill what they supposed their desires were. And we can outrun a lot of grief this way. The participant would return from the vigil filled with insight to a society that had hostility or amnesia about the experience. I mean, have you ever gone through something really profound and you think, well, I'm going to tell Helen. And you know, Helen comes around for a cup of tea and you finally tell them this profound thing, and they listen and they listen and then they lean forward and they say, I'm so happy for you. It's the loneliest feeling in the world. Zip it. That's the Gnostic information. Or as Goethe would say, tell a wise person or else keep silent. So, they would come back from the wild and could not be met by the wider community because the cord had already been cut. When it comes to prophetic information from the wilderness, there is often little to return to. When they would be preparing to go out, they'd often be saying this, I want to be heard. When they would come back, they would say, how do I speak? How do I speak? How do I learn how to speak? And the long and the joyful labour would begin, that they re-entered their life with a sense of vocation and purpose, those old-fashioned words, that we fall in love with something so profoundly we have something to return to, something to defend, something to be acutely and appropriately indebted to. That's the old mythic understanding. You're meant to be in debt your whole life. It is a mythic travesty to be debt-free. It just depends who you or what you're indebted to. I used to work with a Dagara medicine man called Malidoma Same, and he told me this story, that when a woman is giving birth in a hut, all the people, old and young, all the animals, all the birds, they would gather around the hut and wait. And when the baby would come out and it would make its first wild sounds into the air, to a Dagara ear, it's saying something. It's saying this: where am I? Am I safe? Do you claim me? Very important. Do you claim me? And at that moment, the birds, the animals, the air itself roars into claiming the young one, gathers her in, makes absolutely stone cold sure that there's no possibility of a misunderstanding, that the soul has not been loved, named and claimed. Now here's the thing. To the Dagara, they believe if you don't receive such a thing within 60 seconds of being born, then you may spend the next 60 years trying to receive from one person the cry you should have received from the entire village on the moment of your birth. That is too grievous a weight for any set of shoulders to carry. But there are millions of us now, grievous to our core, unclaimed, and thinking that that love cry is a mature sound. It is not. It is the sound a baby makes. It is the sound a baby is meant to make. But how do we acknowledge that sense of loss we have? But how do we elevate the expression? As adults, myth could be a sound that we make, and it could give a greater elegance to that yearning and lonesomeness some of us feel. Over time it could transmute it, that the words of myth have an alchemical property, lead to gold. Okay, so now we are moving to the conclusion. Myth has some fundamental things to say. If you love somebody, love them. There's not much that can be done about it. Grieve the bird that flew away if you must, and let it be your walk in life. Have an elegant limp so you don't habitually point out the stumble in others. That there's a nutrition in grief, an artfulness, but there's precious little in bitterness. Find a wild way of telling the truth. Find a wild way of telling the truth. Myth says there are implications to your suffering that may never be revealed to you. Worlds within worlds. So it is and always was. And we are allowed to be wrecked. We are allowed to be blank. We are allowed to be empty. None of us is a full moon all the time. Even the gods are filled with nuance, visiting quiet gardens in the cool of the day. Even the owl has her sadness. I work a lot with younger folk, and one of the things that is starting to be spoken of more and more is sorrow. They can sense the propulsion of our times and the grinding uncertainty of it. And it's good for them to know that there is a room in the castle for grief as well as feasting. I don't think we're ever really united by victory stories anyway, but by having the courage to speak of what fell away. And in this time of great falling away, myth is a deep form of to courteously address the vital sorrows and the victories of our time. It has substance and it has panache. Even as I write, the gods are gnawing on the edge of my sentences. I think we could stop saying that the gods will die if we stop thinking about them. That is a degraded idea, yet it's what so many claim mythology is. We've just thought them up. But what if they were allowing us to think them? What if we were getting thought? Not as mannequin puppets, but as part of a profound conversation we can barely remember the moves for anymore. If they have fled, then we can start to feel sorry for them, and that's very foolish. If they have fled, we can't remember which temple we serve in anymore, and we're all serving something. The last thing I want to say is this. I want to emphasize the need for older women and men in what I'm saying. I notice this, my mum is the wisest person that I know. And I just notice as she hits her 70s, it's as if she's becoming invisible to some people. And it's just, it's disgusting. So I want to say this. I want to emphasize the need for older women and men in all of this. It is the exact moment that society starts to turn its back to your insights that you most need to be heard. You see, from a mythic perspective, my mum is an ancestor in training. She is an ancestor in training. She is a hinge dweller. I haven't told her that yet. I'm not sure how she'd take it. To a culture worthy of the name, that is a privileged position. An older man or woman is closer to what Jung called the lament of the dead. And they are surrounded by particles of thought that many of us younger ones haven't even glimpsed yet. Please describe them to us. You could change into an even wilder shape, then re-emerge saying even more outrageous things. Let us sail to Byzantium. There is a time to stop looking for honey and become the bee. There is a time to stop looking for shelter and become a tree. Often when we trust our passion, we find it touches other people, and Shelley speaks of this in his defense of poetry. A great poem is a fountain forever flowing with the waters of wisdom and delight, and after one person and one age has exhausted all its defined effluence within their peculiar relations enable them to share, another and another and another and another succeeds, and new relations are ever developed, the source of unforeseen and unconceived delight. Or, as another poet, Jack Gilbert, says, we must risk delight. To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil. Do you want to hear that again?
Yeah. Yes.
We must risk delight. To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil.
Who said that?
A guy called Jack Gilbert, wonderful poet. Tell me a story of deep delight. This may sound grandiose, which it does, or a little evangelical, but so be it. The times demand it. If half the essays in one copy of the Temenos Review was taken into the psyche of a young generation, we would have nothing less than a revolution of the heart on our hands. They are amazing pieces of work up there. There is no shortage of wisdom, but we need people that can gleefully point to it, be it even. If taxi drivers in Iran can quote Hafez from memory, which they can, then I look forward to a dawn river trip down the Thames with all of us, as Sorab and Rushdom erupts from the tannoy and the sun decides to rise for another day. This is not hyperbole. Romantic reverie is not an indulgence, it's a call to participation. And through experiencing it, cultivate it, tempering it through the endurance of time, a kind of sophisticated hope can emerge. As any storyteller knows, the tale of a story always jumps into the mouth of its beginning. So a story truthfully told has restoration in it, even in the ashes of our times as they cover the crops of our fields. Let's take courage. Let's take courage, and not the long road to our morality. Not a morality enforced, but one ebullient, dynamic, and utterly vital. An arising, not a suppression. Set it free like a wild horse over the goddamn hill. It is what Black Elk would say makes a proper human being. It's what Owen Barfield called romanticism come of age. The doorway to mercy is still open. Let's see if we can't make a thundercloud blush. Thank you.
Thank you.